Spring, 1945. The air in Texas was thick with heat and dust. For 19-year-old Erica Weber, stepping off the transport truck, it felt like another world. She was a German prisoner of war, braced for the monsters she'd seen on propaganda posters. She expected a camp built on hate. But what she saw made no sense. Past the barbed wire, there wasn't a punishment yard. There was a church, a simple wooden chapel. An American sergeant pointed. "Services are Sunday," he said calmly. "You can go. No cuffs." It was an offer so stunning it felt like a trap. She could only stare, her mind screaming one question. Is this really America's enemy camp? But before we find out what happened inside that chapel, if you want to hear more incredible untold stories that challenge everything we think we know, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's amazing to see where these stories reached. The truck's engine died, with a final, shuddering cough, leaving only the sound of the Texas wind whistling through the cracks in the wooden siding. For 19-year-old Erica Weber, the silence was more menacing than the journey's rumble. She and the other women were herded out into a blast of heat so thick it felt like a wool blanket pressed against her face. She kept her eyes down, her body braced for the shouting, the shoves, the casual cruelty she had been told defined the American soldier. Her father, before he was lost in the Hamburg bombings, had called them savages without history. Her brother, before the army swallowed him whole, had called them cowboys who shot first and never thought at all. Erica believed it because, after all she had seen, it was easy to believe the world had run out of goodness. But the shouting never came. Instead, there was a quiet order to the place. The fences were high and crowned with barbed wire. Yes, but inside them, the barracks were arranged in neat rows. The dust was swept into clean lines. Men in crisp khaki uniforms moved with a purpose that felt more like management than menace. It was disorienting. This wasn't the chaotic pit of despair she had imagined. This was a camp. Just a camp. As she was led toward a long, low building, her gaze drifted past the guard towers, past the laundry lines snapping in the wind. And then she saw it. It stood apart from the other structures, simple and unassuming, with a modest steeple pointing a wooden finger toward the vast, pale sky. A church, inside the wire. It was so impossible, so utterly contradictory to everything she knew about war, that for a moment she thought the heat was making her see things. A sergeant with kind, tired eyes and graying temples noticed her staring. He had a gentle way about him, a calmness that seemed out of place on a man wearing a soldier's uniform. He was Sergeant Ben Walters, though she wouldn't learn his name until later. He gestured with his chin toward the chapel. "Services are on Sunday," he said, his voice even and low. "You're welcome to go. No cuffs." He said it so simply, as if he were offering a glass of water. Not a trick, not a test. Just a fact. The words hung in the air, heavier than the humidity. Erica could only nod, the lump in her throat too thick to allow for words. The other women muttered, their suspicion a low hum, but Erica felt a different sensation, a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of something she thought had been bombed out of her. Later that afternoon, drawn by a force she couldn't name, she slipped away and pushed open the chapel door. The air inside was cool and smelled of pine and dry dust. Sunlight, tinted gold, streamed through plain glass windows, illuminating rows of simple wooden pews. There was no grand altar, no stained glass telling stories of saints. There was only a plain wooden cross on the far wall. It was humble, quiet, and perfect. It was a place for God, not for a nation. She sank onto a bench in the back, the worn wood smooth beneath her trembling fingers. For the first time in years, she felt the rigid armor of fear begin to crack. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of relief so profound it ached. Maybe here, In this impossible place, she could find a piece of the girl she was before the world burned. Her moment of peace was shattered back in the barracks. A woman named Margot Feldhaus, older and with eyes as hard and gray as river stones, watched her with undisguised contempt. Margot had been a teacher in Dresden, and she carried the ghosts of her students in her clipped, precise words. "I saw you," she said, her voice low and sharp, "coming from their little church. Don't be a fool, child, it's a performance. They build a chapel to convince themselves they have a soul, while their bombs take ours. Kindness is just a cleaner cage." Margot's bitterness was a wall, thick and impenetrable, and Erica felt her own fragile hope begin to wither under its shadow. Was she a fool? Was this all just a more sophisticated form of cruelty? The doubt lingered, a poison in her thoughts. But the memory of the quiet, sunlit chapel was stronger. The next day, she decided she had to know. She had to choose what to believe. Ignoring Margot's scornful gaze, Erica walked back to the chapel, this time needing the solitude more than ever. She slipped inside, the silence wrapping around her like a blanket. She didn't pray. She didn't know the words anymore. She just sat, breathing in the quiet. A few minutes later, the door creaked open again. She tensed, expecting a guard or one of Margot's followers. But it was a boy, not much younger than she was, in a freshly pressed private's uniform. He was the sergeant's son, though she didn't know that, Caleb Walters. He paused, seeing her, then seemed to decide she wasn't a threat. He slid into a pew several rows behind her, on the opposite side of the aisle. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the cross on the wall, his young face a mask of confusion and anger. He was the enemy. He was a boy. The silence stretched between them, holding not threat or suspicion, but a strange, shared sorrow. In that quiet wooden room, thousands of miles from home, they were not prisoner and guard, not German and American. They were just two souls, adrift in the wreckage of a war they did not start, seeking a moment of peace. The stillness of the chapel lingered with Erica, a quiet pocket of peace she carried into the noisy, orderly chaos of the camp. It was this memory that prompted her to act. She had been a nurse's aide back in Hamburg, before the world fell apart, and she knew the simple, steadying rhythm of medical work. She volunteered for the infirmary. The work itself, folding bandages until her fingers were numb, mopping floors until they gleamed, changing soiled linens, was a familiar comfort. The challenge was not the labor, but the woman who ran the small clinic with an iron will and a perpetually weary gaze. Her name was Alma Ortiz. Alma was a civilian nurse, a Mexican-American woman whose competence was as sharp as the antiseptic smell that clung to her clothes. She moved with a clipped efficiency, her dark eyes missing nothing. She treated the German women with a cold, professional correctness that was more unnerving than outright hostility. Erica learned from another POW that Alma's younger brother had been killed in the Ardennes. The knowledge settled between them, a silent, heavy thing. Alma never spoke of it, but Erica could feel it in the way the nurse's hands tightened when she heard German spoken too loudly, or in the way she looked right through the women as if they were ghosts. Erica met this wall of grief not with words, but with work. She was quiet, meticulous, and always gentle. She never offered excuses for the war, never defended her homeland. She simply did her job, tending to the sick with a soft-spoken compassion that asked for nothing in return. One afternoon, while changing a dressing for a woman delirious with fever, Alma watched her. For the first time, the nurse's gaze held not suspicion, but a flicker of grudging respect. The ice had not melted, but a hairline crack had appeared. On the other side of the camp, Sergeant Ben Walters was having a different kind of difficult conversation. His son, Caleb, home on a brief leave before shipping out, was brimming with the righteous anger of the very young. They stood near the camp's edge, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. Caleb couldn't understand his father's patient demeanor toward the prisoners. "They're the enemy, Dad," he said, his voice tight. "Why do we let them go to church? Why do we give them books? My friends are over there dying." Ben didn't look at his son. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "Because the rules we follow are what make us different," he said, his voice low and steady. "The Geneva Convention isn't about being nice, son. It's about holding on to our own humanity when it's hardest. If we become what we're fighting, then we've already lost." Caleb kicked at a clump of dry grass, unconvinced. The gap between a father's measured mercy and a son's thirst for clear-cut justice felt as wide and vast as the Texas plain. Then came Easter Sunday. In a gesture that stunned the entire camp, Ben announced that the morning service would be open to everyone, POWs and American staff alike. The chapel that morning was a study in tension. The German women sat on one side, stiff and watchful. The American soldiers and staff sat on the other, their unease a palpable presence. Margot Feldhaus was conspicuously absent, pacing like a caged panther back at the barracks. But Alma Ortiz was there. She had come, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps drawn by the same need for solace that had first led Erica to the chapel's door. She sat in the very back, a solitary figure with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The service was simple, the pastor's words about resurrection and new life feeling distant and hollow in a room so divided. Then, during a moment of quiet reflection, a voice rose from the German side. It was Erica. She began to sing, soft at first, then growing in clarity and strength. It was an old German hymn, a song her grandmother had taught her, its melody filled with a profound and ancient sorrow. The language was foreign to the Americans, but the emotion was universal. It spoke of loss, of endurance, of a desperate, flickering hope in the darkness. The room fell completely silent. Soldiers who had been fidgeting went still. Women who had been weeping quietly lifted their heads. Erica sang with her eyes closed, not as a performance, but as a prayer offered up from the deepest part of her soul. Her voice filled the small chapel, transcending the barbed wire and the uniforms, and for a few minutes there was no enemy, no prisoner, no German or American. There was only shared humanity, united in a moment of heartbreaking grace. In the back pew, Alma Ortiz bowed her head, and silent tears streamed down her face. She was not crying for an enemy. She was crying for her brother. She was crying for herself. Outside the chapel window, Margot stood watching, her face unreadable. She saw them not as captors and captives, but as something else, something she couldn't name. And in that moment, under the warm Texas sun, it felt as if peace had already begun. The fragile peace of Easter Sunday was a dream that dissolved with the morning sun. A week later, a new convoy of trucks arrived, kicking up a storm of dust and depositing a different breed of prisoner. These were not the weary nurses, clerks, and factory workers who had arrived with Erica. These women were younger, harder, their eyes alight with a feverish, defiant pride. They were former SS auxiliaries and fanatical leaders from the League of German Girls, and they carried the war with them, not as a memory of loss, but as a creed still burning in their blood. The delicate ecosystem of Camp Hearn was poisoned overnight. The newcomers sneered at the library, calling the books American propaganda. They refused work details, spat on the ground when guards passed, and held secret meetings in the barracks that buzzed with a hateful energy. Margot Feldhaus, for all her cynicism, seemed to find a grim satisfaction in their arrival. "You see," she said to Erica, a thin, triumphant smile on her lips. "This is the truth of it. Not your hymns and your gentle sergeants. This is the war you seem to have forgotten." Erica felt a cold dread creep into her heart. The camp was no longer a place of cautious hope. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The spark came in the mess hall. A young guard, barely older than Caleb, gave a sharp order to one of the new women who had deliberately let a tray of dishes crash to the floor. The woman answered with a vicious curse. When the guard moved to escort her out, another POW, a tall, raw-boned girl with the eyes of a wolf, lunged at him from behind. There was a sickening crack as her fist connected with his jaw. The guard crumpled to the floor, and for a heartbeat, the entire hall was frozen in shocked silence. Then came the whistles, the shouts, the sound of boots on concrete as the other guards swarmed in. The retaliation from the camp authorities was swift and absolute. All privileges were revoked. The library was locked. The small garden plot was declared off limits. The work programs, including Erica's duties in the infirmary, were suspended indefinitely. And, most devastatingly of all, a heavy padlock appeared on the door of the chapel. The unspoken truce was over. The camp reverted to what it had always been beneath the surface, a prison. The American guards, who had begun to show glimmers of familiarity, even friendliness, now wore masks of cold, impersonal authority. Ben Walter's kind eyes became shuttered and distant. The invisible wall between captor and captive had been rebuilt, thicker and higher than ever before. Desperate, Erica sought out Margot. She found her sitting on her bunk, mending a torn uniform with neat, angry stitches. "You have to talk to them," Erica pleaded, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "The new ones. They'll listen to you. You can make them understand that this violence hurts all of us." Margot didn't even look up from her sewing. "Understand what?" she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "That we should be docile and grateful for our cages? That we should sing hymns for the men who firebombed our cities? No. Let them rage. Let the Americans see that we are not broken." "But the chapel," Erica began, her voice cracking. "Alma, we were building something." "We were building nothing," Margot snapped, finally looking up, her eyes blazing with a grief so cold it was a fire. "You were deluding yourself. This is who we are. This is who they are. There is nothing in between but wire." Margot's refusal was a final, killing blow to Erica's hope. She was a fool. She had allowed herself to believe in a fantasy, and now the brutal reality had crashed down on her. That night, she took the small, precious stack of letters from her home, the last words she had from her mother, a faded postcard from her brother before he vanished on the Eastern Front, and carried them behind the barracks. With trembling hands, she struck a smuggled match and lit the corner of the top envelope. She watched as the flame greedily consumed the paper, turning familiar handwriting into black, curling ash. The words of love, the memories of a life that no longer existed, drifted up as smoke into the dark, starless Texas sky. She was erasing the past because the future no longer seemed to exist. A few days later, the final piece of her fragile world was swept away. She heard it from another woman who overheard two guards talking. Private Caleb Walters had been shipped out. His unit was destined for the Pacific. He was gone, just like that. There had been no chance to say goodbye, no final shared glance across the quiet chapel. The boy with the angry, searching eyes was gone, sent back into the inferno of the war. Erica felt his absence as a hollow ache, another ghost to add to the silent, ever-growing crowd in her heart. The hope that had bloomed so briefly in the little wooden church was now nothing more than ashes. The silence that followed the lockdown was worse than the shouting had been. A heavy, suffocating tension settled over Camp Hearn, infecting everything and everyone. The air, already thick with summer heat, grew thicker still with unspoken resentments. From Alma Ortiz's perspective, the change was stark and depressing. Before the incident, the infirmary had been a kind of neutral ground, a place where the lines blurred. Now, The German women brought in for treatment were either sullenly silent or openly hostile. The easygoing guards who used to joke with her at the start of her shift now just gave curt nods and kept their distance. The invisible armor everyone had begun to shed was back in place, heavier and more fortified than before. Alma felt the weight of it all in her bones. The long hours, the oppressive heat, the constant, simmering atmosphere of distrust, it was grinding her down. Her grief for her brother, which had momentarily softened in the shared humanity of the chapel, now returned with a vengeance, sharper and more isolating than ever. She poured herself into her work, her movements becoming even more precise, her voice even more clipped, using the rigid discipline of medicine to keep her own fraying emotions in check. She was restocking a shelf with gauze one sweltering afternoon, the heat in the small room making her dizzy, when the world tilted sideways. The shelves seemed to rush toward her, the neat stacks of bandages blurring into a meaningless white smear. Then, darkness. When Alma's eyes fluttered open, the first thing she saw was Erica Weber's face, pale with concern. Erica was holding a damp cloth to her forehead, her touch surprisingly gentle. The other women in the infirmary were hovering near the door, kept back by Erica's quiet but firm command. "The heat," Erica said softly, in English. "You need water, rest." Alma tried to push herself up, a protest forming on her lips. She was the nurse, she was in charge, but a wave of nausea forced her back down. She was vulnerable, and in her vulnerability, she had been cared for by the one person she had tried so hard to keep at a distance. To help an American nurse, a captor, was a serious breach of the prisoner's new, unwritten code. Erica had risked punishment, the scorn of the other women, simply to be kind. It was an act of quiet rebellion against the prevailing tide of hatred, and it landed directly in Alma's heart. The incident did not go unnoticed. A guard had reported Erica's quick thinking to Sergeant Ben Walters. For Ben, the news was a flicker of light in a deepening gloom. Since the lockdown, he had been walking a tightrope, enforcing the strict new regulations, while privately mourning the loss of the fragile community that had begun to form. He saw the hardening in the eyes of his men, heard the casual dehumanization in their language, and it felt like a personal failure. His son, Caleb, was now somewhere in the vast, brutal theater of the Pacific, and Ben found himself praying not just for his son's safety, but for his soul, praying that Caleb would not let the war extinguish the spark of decency he had tried so hard to nurture in him. Erica's selfless act was a reminder that such sparks, however small, could still survive in the darkest of places. That Sunday morning arrived gray and oppressive, the sky the color of dirty dishwater. There was no announcement, no change in the official routine. But as the camp bell tolled 7, the women in Erica's barracks saw a lone figure walking toward the chapel. It was Sergeant Walters. He stopped at the padlocked door, inserted a key, and with a quiet click, the lock sprang open. He swung the door wide, and then, without a word, he walked away. There were no guards posted. No orders were given. It was simply an invitation, left hanging in the humid air. A few women, hesitant at first, emerged from the barracks and began to walk, one by one, toward the open door. It was a pilgrimage of the weary. Erica was among the first. As she stepped inside, the familiar coolness and scent of pine felt like a homecoming. More followed, filling the pews in a quiet that was different from the enforced silence of the camp. This was a chosen silence, a shared need for sanctuary. Then, just as the last of them had settled, another figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray morning light. It was Margot Feldhaus. Her face was a mask, impossible to read, but she entered. For the first time, she stepped across the threshold of the place she had so scornfully dismissed as a trap. She didn't join the others, but took a seat in the very back, a solitary observer in the house of her enemies. A moment later, Ben Walters stepped up to the simple wooden lectern. He wasn't in his formal uniform, but in simple fatigues, looking less like a soldier and more like the hardware store owner he once was. He looked out at the faces before him, American and German, captor and captive, all gathered in the same fragile space. "There are rules in war," he began, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. "And then, there is the war itself. They are not the same thing. The war doesn't end with a signature on a piece of paper. It doesn't end when one side surrenders." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them all, finally resting for a moment on Margot. "It ends when the hate does." Ben's words hung in the chapel, not as an order or a sermon, but as a simple, profound truth. They did not magically erase the fences or the animosity, but they did change the quality of the silence. A quiet understanding began to flow back into the spaces between people. The camp remained under strict rules, but the suffocating tension eased. The guards' eyes lost some of their hardness. Small courtesies returned. A fragile truce, born not of regulations but of a shared weariness, settled over Camp Hearn as the summer burned toward its end. News of the war's end in Europe arrived not with a bang, but with a strange, hollow quiet. There were no celebrations, only a deepening uncertainty. For the women, the end of the war did not mean freedom. It simply meant they were prisoners of a nation that was no longer an active enemy. Months crawled by. The Texas autumn painted the landscape in muted shades of brown and gold. Then, one afternoon, a truck from the Red Cross arrived, bearing not medical supplies, but a precious cargo of delayed mail. A guard handed Erica a small, battered parcel. Her name was written on it in unfamiliar handwriting. Her heart clenched with a familiar, painful hope. Perhaps it was word of her brother. But the postmark was from an army post office in California. Confused, she carefully tore it open. Inside was a single folded letter and a small, square photograph. The letter was dated months earlier, from a place called Okinawa. The looping, youthful script was instantly recognizable. It was from Caleb Walters. "Dear Erica," it began. She had to read her own name twice to believe it. "I don't know if this will ever reach you. We're not supposed to write to prisoners, but I had to try. My father tells me the camp is quiet again. I hope that's true. I think about that chapel a lot. It's strange what you remember out here. It's not the training or the drills. It's the quiet moments." Her hands began to tremble, and she had to sit down on the edge of her bunk to steady herself. "Before I came to Hearn," the letter continued, "I thought I knew everything. I knew who the enemy was. I knew what we had to do to them. It was simple, black and white. Then I saw you, not just you, but all of you, sitting in that church. You just looked like people, scared and tired just like us. And when you sang that song on Easter, I didn't understand the words, but I understood the feeling. My father always talked about mercy, about seeing the person, and not the uniform. I thought it was weakness. I realize now it takes more strength than pulling a trigger. He's sent me this picture. I don't know who took it, but I'm glad they did. It helps me remember. It helps me remember that there's a world beyond this noise and this mud. Thank you for that. You helped restore my faith in things I thought I was supposed to be fighting for. Stay safe." It was signed, simply, Caleb. With unsteady fingers, Erica picked up the photograph. It was her. She was standing just outside the chapel, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far away. The morning sun was behind her, catching the wisps of her hair and creating a halo of light around her silhouette. She was looking not at the camera, but at something beyond it, her expression one of quiet, contemplative sorrow. She didn't remember the moment being taken, But she remembered the feeling, that brief, fragile instant of peace before the hardliners had arrived and shattered everything. She turned the small photograph over. On the back, written in the same youthful script, was a question. 7 simple words that struck her with the force of a physical blow. "Is this really America's enemy camp?" Erica's breath hitched. A wave of emotion so powerful, it buckled her knees washed over her. She pressed the photograph to her chest, the sharp corners digging into her palm. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of grief or despair. They were tears of recognition. The question Caleb had scrawled on the back of the photograph, the same question that had echoed in her own mind from the first day she arrived, was no longer a question. She had been searching for an answer in the actions of the guards, in the rules of the camp, in the words of Sergeant Walters. But the answer was not in them. It was in her. It was in Alma's quiet respect, in Ben's stubborn decency, and now, in a letter from a boy thousands of miles away, fighting a war in the Pacific. The answer was a choice to see humanity where you were told to see a monster, a choice to build a bridge where others built walls, a choice to sing a hymn in a room full of enemies. She looked down at the image of the girl bathed in sunlight, a girl who looked impossibly young and impossibly hopeful, and for the first time in a very long time, Erica Weber recognized herself. Hamburg, 1947. The city was a ghost of itself, a landscape of skeletal ruins and gaping wounds where grand buildings had once stood. The air tasted of damp plaster and coal smoke, a constant reminder of both the destruction and the stubborn, desperate effort of rebuilding. Yet, amidst the rubble, life persisted. The skeletal frames of buildings were slowly being fleshed out with new brick, and the sound of hammers echoed where the sound of sirens once reigned. It was here, in a partially restored building on a street still shadowed by the hollowed-out shell of a cathedral, that Erica Weber ran a small clinic for children. She was 21 now, but the years since her return had carved a quiet maturity onto her features that made her seem older. The timid, uncertain girl from the transport truck was gone, replaced by a woman whose hands were steady, whose voice was calm, and whose eyes held a deep, unshakable clarity. Her clinic was a sanctuary of sorts, a place of warmth and mended things. It was often short on medicine and supplies, but never on gentleness. She tended to children pale with malnutrition, children who flinched at loud noises, children who had seen more loss than any soul ever should. In their small faces, she saw the future of her broken country, and she was determined to nurture it with the same quiet compassion she had first discovered in a Texas infirmary. One cool autumn morning, a postman delivered a small, sturdy parcel, wrapped in brown paper and covered in exotic American stamps. The return address was a town in Texas she had never heard of, but the handwriting on the label was as familiar as if she had seen it yesterday. It was the firm, steady hand of Sergeant Ben Walters. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt, a muscle contracting around a memory. She took the package to a small, quiet room at the back of the clinic, a room she had set aside as a place for reflection, with a single bench and a clean, bare wall. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unwrapped the parcel. Inside, nestled in a bed of wood shavings, was a cross. It was carved from a light-colored wood, simple and unadorned, almost identical to the one that had hung on the wall of the chapel at Camp Hearn. She ran her fingers over the smooth, sanded surface, the scent of pine and Texas dust seeming to rise from the grain, a phantom smell that transported her back across an ocean and 2 years of her life. Then she saw the inscription, burned carefully into the wood at the base of the cross. It was a simple phrase, Ben's quiet voice echoing in every letter. For those who healed without hate. The breath left her body in a long, shuddering sigh. All the unspoken moments, all the fragile connections forged across the wire, came rushing back. She saw Ben's tired, kind eyes as he unlocked the chapel door. She saw Alma Ortiz's face, streaked with tears, as she listened to a German hymn. She saw Caleb's letter, the photograph of a girl standing in the sun, and the question that had become an answer. This small piece of wood was not just a gift. It was a testament. It was proof that what had happened in that small, unlikely pocket of the world had been real, and that it mattered. It was a message that the choices she had made in the dark had been seen, and had cast a light that reached farther than she ever could have imagined. With a reverence she had not felt in years, Erica stood and hung the cross on the plain, whitewashed wall of her small chapel. It looked perfectly at home, a simple symbol of a profound truth. Just then, from the main room of the clinic, came a sound that now filled her days. It was the sound of children laughing, a pure, untroubled cascade of joy that was the most beautiful and defiant sound in the entire, wounded city of Hamburg. It was the sound of life beginning again. They told us we would lose everything in captivity. They were wrong. I found what war hadn't taken: my soul.